She had waited for this moment for years. The long nights spent writing letters, the endless hours imagining a future that no one else believed in, the unwavering hope that love could exist even in the most unlikely of places. She had defended him, stood by him, given up friendships, ignored warnings, and silenced every doubt in her mind. As she walked through the heavy steel doors of the prison, past the rows of watchful eyes and cold, towering walls, her heart pounded with anticipation. She had fought for this. She had earned this. A private moment with the man she had chosen to love. The man who had promised her forever. Some called her reckless. Others called her delusional. But Margaret Wells called it destiny. The guards barely looked at her as she stepped into the small, windowless room where she would finally be alone with her husband. The door closed behind her, the lock clicking into place. For the first time since their wedding inside these very walls, it was just the two of them. No bars. No chains. No barriers. No escape. She didn't scream. Not at first. By the time the guards realized something was wrong, it was too late. What happened inside that room remains one of the most gruesome and shocking crimes ever committed within a prison. A crime so brutal that it changed policies, left investigators speechless, and shattered the illusion that love could save even the most dangerous of men. Why did Margaret Wells marry a man responsible for so much death? Why did she believe she was safe with him? And what really happened inside that conjugal visit room? Tonight, we uncover the truth. Margaret Wells had spent most of her life surrounded by books. As a librarian, she had guided countless people through stories of love, tragedy, and redemption. But at 62, she found herself alone. Her husband of nearly 4 decades had passed away, leaving behind a silence that no amount of reading could fill. The days felt longer. The nights, unbearable. And then she found Daniel Reeves. It started as an act of curiosity, an innocent distraction from the weight of loneliness. A local news story had mentioned a prison pen pal program, designed to help inmates find companionship beyond the cold walls of their confinement. Margaret had never considered writing to a prisoner, but something in her shifted that night. She found herself reading through the profiles, scanning names and crimes she knew she should have turned away from. And then there was Daniel. He was handsome, even in the grainy mugshot. His dark eyes carried a sadness, a story left unfinished. He had been locked away for nearly 2 decades. Life without parole. The words should have been enough to make her scroll past. But she didn't. Instead, she picked up a pen. At first, it was just letters. Carefully written, cautiously worded. She told him about her life, her late husband, her quiet days at the library, the way she still set 2 plates at the dinner table, out of habit more than hope. In return, Daniel wrote about his childhood, his regrets, the way time moved differently in a place where every day felt the same. She convinced herself it was harmless. A conversation between 2 lonely people. But loneliness has a way of making even the most dangerous things feel safe. Margaret's letters became more frequent. The words more intimate. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen, understood in a way no one else had in years. He called her his light in the darkness. His reason to believe in second chances. And then, one day, he called her his love. She hadn't expected it. And yet, it felt inevitable. She was in love with a man she had never touched. A man who had taken lives. A man she believed deserved a second chance. Her friends tried to reason with her. They reminded her of who he was, of what he had done. They begged her to stop visiting, to stop writing. But Margaret had made up her mind. She wasn't just going to love Daniel Reeves. She was going to fight for him. It was 2019 when Margaret first stepped into the confines of Blackwood State Penitentiary. The prison was known for housing some of the most violent offenders in the state. The kind of men whose crimes filled headlines, whose names were whispered with fear. Daniel Reeves had been there for nearly 20 years. His crimes were unspeakable. A killing spree that had left 6 people dead. A home invasion that turned into a massacre. The details of his case had shocked the nation. The brutality. The lack of remorse. The way he had smiled in court when the guilty verdict was read. Margaret knew all of this. And yet, when she stepped into the visiting room for the first time and saw him sitting there, waiting for her, none of it mattered. He wasn't a monster to her. He was the man she loved. She visited him every weekend, bringing books, letters, and the soft laughter of someone who still believed in happy endings. She spoke to lawyers, pushed for conjugal rights, argued that love was not something the state should deny. It took time. It took relentless effort. But Margaret won. And in the summer of 2021, inside the cold, gray walls of Blackwood State Penitentiary, she became Mrs. Daniel Reeves. The ceremony was small. A prison chaplain officiated. There were no flowers, no music, no family present. Just 2 people standing together, separated by the choices that had brought them here. To Margaret, it was the beginning of a love story. To everyone else, it was a tragedy waiting to unfold. Margaret Wells had always been a rational woman, someone who relied on facts, logic, and the wisdom found in books. But love has a way of reshaping reality. The deeper she fell for Daniel Reeves, the more she rewrote the story of who he really was. She no longer spoke of his past crimes with unease. Instead, she spoke of injustice, of wrongful convictions, of a system designed to bury men like Daniel. She told anyone who would listen that he had been misunderstood. That the evidence had been circumstantial. That he was a victim, not a monster. Her friends stopped trying to change her mind. The warnings were met with silence, then avoidance. Conversations about Daniel turned into arguments, and arguments turned into distance. Soon, the people who had once been her closest confidants were strangers to her. Margaret didn't need them. She had Daniel. And Daniel had her exactly where he wanted. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible. She emptied her savings into his appeals, hiring lawyers who promised new evidence, a fresh trial, a chance at freedom. She sold her late husband's belongings, saying she needed to move forward. She quit her part-time work at the library. There was no need for distractions. Daniel was her future. And she would do whatever it took to bring him home. The prison guards knew his type. Daniel Reeves was not a reformed man. He was not the remorseful, rehabilitated prisoner Margaret believed him to be. He was dangerous. His time behind bars had not softened him. If anything, it had only sharpened the cruelty inside him. There were reports, warnings, hidden in the folds of prison records. Fights that ended with broken bones. Contraband smuggled through visitors too afraid to say no. A cellmate who had been transferred after telling guards he slept with one eye open, because Daniel had whispered, night after night, about how easy it would be to kill a man in his sleep. They had seen men like Daniel before. They had seen women like Margaret before. They had tried to warn her. You're being manipulated. He's dangerous. He doesn't love you. He loves control. She had smiled, thanked them for their concern, and continued walking down the hallway toward him. The fight for conjugal visits had been long and exhausting, but Margaret had never been a woman who gave up easily. At 62, she had stood before the courts, before prison officials, before anyone who dared to tell her no, and made them listen. She was his wife. She had rights. And after years of battles, she won. The visits were to be supervised, at first. Short meetings in a heavily monitored area. She held his hands, traced the lines of his face, memorized every detail she had only seen through plexiglass before. She wrote to her best friend that night. It's finally happening. He's changed. I knew he would. The guards saw something else. Daniel had a way of looking at her, watching her, studying her, that made them uneasy. The way he touched her, not with tenderness, but with something that lingered too long, something that pressed just a little too hard. Something that made even the most hardened guards shift uncomfortably. They discussed it among themselves. The way his behavior changed when she was near. The way he went from cold, calculating silence to something else entirely. Something darker. Still, policies were policies. She had won the right to see her husband privately. And so, on a cold October afternoon, Margaret walked into the conjugal visit room, excited, nervous, unaware. A guard on duty would later say, she was glowing. Like a bride on her wedding night. They locked the door behind her. She never walked out. The visitation area was small. A single bed, a table, 2 chairs. No cameras. No way for the guards to see what was happening inside. Margaret had fought for this moment. She had dreamed of it, written about it, imagined every possible detail. The first time she would hold him without barriers. The first time they would be alone. She didn't hesitate as the door locked behind her. Outside, the guards continued their rounds. The prison was a machine, moving forward, uninterrupted. The sound of voices, metal doors clanging shut, the rhythmic footsteps on concrete. Inside, Margaret was finally face to face with the man she had risked everything for. The first sign that something was wrong came nearly an hour later. A knock on the door. Routine. Standard procedure. A reminder that time was nearly up. No response. Another knock. Louder this time. Still nothing. Inside the control room, the guard monitoring visitation shifts exchanged a glance with his partner. This isn't right. Conjugal visits followed strict rules. Any sign of trouble, and the door had to be opened immediately. The guard unlocked the door. And everything went still. The scene inside that room would haunt them forever. Margaret lay motionless on the bed, her body twisted unnaturally, her face frozen in an expression of something that wasn't just fear, it was realization. The moment she had understood what was happening, and the horrifying truth that she was completely alone with a killer. Blood smeared the sheets, the floor, the walls. A crimson trail of violence that told the story of a struggle. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of the bed. Silent. Expressionless. His hands were stained red. His clothes soaked through. A guard stepped forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What the hell did you do?" Daniel tilted his head, considering the question. She was never leaving. Margaret had fought. That much was clear. The autopsy would later reveal the full extent of what she endured in those final moments. Bruises covered her arms, defensive wounds carved into her skin where she had tried, desperately, to stop him. Broken bones. Lacerations. A crime scene so violent it stunned even the most experienced investigators. But the most disturbing discovery? There was no sign of hesitation from Daniel. No sign that this had been a crime of passion, a sudden loss of control. It had been slow. Calculated. He had taken his time. A plan set in motion the moment she stepped inside that room. The public outrage was immediate. Margaret's family, her daughter, her sister, the friends who had begged her to see reason, were shattered. How could this have happened? How could the system have allowed her to fight for the right to be alone with a monster? Prison officials scrambled for answers. Protocols were re-evaluated. Security footage was analyzed, statements taken, reports filed. But nothing changed the outcome. Margaret was dead. And Daniel Reeves, already a convicted killer, had nothing left to lose. His confession was chilling. Matter of fact. Emotionless. I knew she would come. I knew she would fight to see me. A pause. A slow smile. I let her. Psychologists dissected the case. Experts were called in to explain what had happened, to try to answer the unanswerable. Why do women fall in love with men like Daniel Reeves? What is it about convicted killers that draws people in, that convinces them they are different? Hybristophilia. The term itself was clinical. Cold. It couldn't begin to explain the depth of Margaret's belief in him, the devotion that blinded her to the danger. The letters she wrote, the diary entries filled with dreams of a life together. Her final words, written just days before the visit that would end her life. I finally have everything I ever wanted. I just know we'll be together forever. She was right. Just not in the way she had imagined. Was this preventable? Could someone have stopped Margaret before she stepped into that room for the last time? Or was she always destined to meet this end, blinded by love, by trust, by the belief that she could change a man who had already proven what he was capable of? And what about Daniel Reeves? Was this his plan from the beginning? A long game of control, manipulation, and deception? Or was there a moment, an instant inside that room, when something snapped, when years of confinement, rage, and obsession exploded into violence? More importantly, would you ever write to a prisoner? It's easy to say no. Easy to believe you could never fall into a situation like this. But Margaret never thought she would either. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend. A woman who spent her life surrounded by books, by stories, by the comfort of words on a page. And yet, she became a character in the darkest story of all, one she never got to finish. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Because stories like this aren't just crime stories. They're cautionary tales. They make us question how well we truly know people. How easy it is to be deceived. And why, time and time again, society remains captivated by the ones who destroy lives, rather than the ones who lose them. Stay tuned. Because this case will haunt you.